Speaking
song.
of constant sources of joy, let's talk about suburban school districts
Yeah,
and gigantic budgets and state level
in
policy.
Texas, in
Texas.
Texas.
Money. Oh, we ain't got none but honey.
Yeah, let me get my notes up, which I think we should tell everyone that our running document is called Stop and Fisk Notes
That's right.
because an early an early title for this podcast was Stop and Fisk.
I
And my
still
partner
think it's
Shelly
brilliant.
my partner Shelly put the kibosh on that real fast. I
Yeah.
think that was right, but also I wanted to
Yes.
give it a shout out, you know?
This is exactly. It's good to have it sort of low key in an episode and not,
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the
yeah.
cover art.
So we were talking about Alaska in a previous episode, and you were started talking about Texas, and I was like, let's
Yes.
talk about Texas because it's a very interesting, very interesting place with its own interesting school finance, which actually echoes other episodes we've done, particularly on Vermont when it comes to
Yep.
centralization and redistribution. But also, it's just like it's run by fascists right now in the state government.
Hmm.
And also, it's relevant for today because people got mad at me on TikTok when I made a video about Lake Travis Independent School District, which is what we're talking about today. Mea culpa, like I get things wrong sometimes. It's complicated
Sure.
school finance, and to try to put everything together, I think in the way that we do, it's not just school finance, the technical stuff, but it's like sort of
Right.
political economy of it. You're sort of, it's a lot of plates spinning, and if we get one thing wrong or another, just reach out and tell us.
Yeah.
So I got something wrong. But yeah, we got a request to look at Lake Travis Independent School District, which is a suburb of Austin, and it's also, I guess, near Spicewood, Texas,
Hmm.
which is what the commenter, the requester, the caller asked for. And I'll just, like usual, I'll read the request, and we'll go from there. So here's
Yeah.
the request from a caller. Just curious why so many schools are in a deficit and what is really driving it. We have very high taxes, and everyone that was not part of the skeleton crew was let go. Seeing what is happening in Austin, Texas, has me worried about my future as an educator. They say enrollment is the cause, but from what I'm understanding, Texas is one of the few states that gives funding based on attendance, not just per student enrollment. I've only seen one of your posts, so I'm hoping I'm using this form correctly. Thank you. Well, requester, caller, you did use the form properly, and let's talk about Lake Travis. I feel like as usual, there's a state story here, but there's also a very local story, and I feel
Hmm.
like the dominant narratives around why deficits, layoffs, cuts, and closures in these particular kinds of what I would call like wealthy, like extravagant
Yeah.
districts, like are facing these bunch. So I don't know. Do you want to? Because let me say more thing here. One of the things that people got mad at me for on TikTok was that in my video I did not talk about recapture. Uh,
Interesting.
they were very unhappy with. I think people were sometimes people get a little mad, at someone just flying in, and it's the sort of
Sure.
get my my hometown out of your mouth kind of situation. But I didn't talk about recapture. I wasn't super familiar with it. I knew that there's something called Robinhood. I'd seen it,
Hmm.
but I didn't know just how intense people feel about recapture in Texas right now, particularly in Austin and in the Austin suburbs. I got a lot of comments saying like, "You have to talk about recapture. Please talk about
Yeah.
recapture."
Yeah.
So I think we need to talk about recapture, but we also need to talk about stadiums. So and bond
Yeah.
financing in Texas.
I
So
love
I
how
don't know, where should we
frequently that's
start?
coming up. Let's
Let's start with the state, huh?
sure. Let's start with the state. Let me also address the caller's sort of itemized questions from the bottom
Mm,
up,
yeah.
if I to the extent that I can remember them, as you, have just read them. But the the first thing, real quick, people say it's because of enrollment, but Texas is one of the states that, funds schools based on attendance. That's true. Uh, where these two things are probably colliding in the discourse is between sort of a general nationwide, worldwide trend in declining enrollments, period, with the idea that because per pupil funding is often pegged to enrollment, and attendance is obviously very closely linked to enrollment. Not It's not one to one, but they're not really all as separate as people might think. And we could talk about the
Right.
specificity of that. Texas is one of 6 states that funds based on attendance rather than enrollment. So I'm just imagining that these are two things that are colliding, but they're really talking about the same thing. People are like, basically, we've got too much school, too many spaces, we fund per pupil. And so, as the number of students that we have declines, it becomes less efficient to fund schools. And so, we've got to recapture. Well, I don't want to use that word. We've got
Yeah, it is the
to
word.
claw back some efficiency by cutting, firing, and closing. I think that's
I feel like
basically what.
recapture is the, like, Pee Wee Herman word of the day, like, every time we say recapture, it's gonna be like, "Arr!"
The second thing that the commenter talked about was Austin. And Lake Travis ISD, like, so much of what's happened, there's a stadium story that we will absolutely talk about, and a bonding story, in particular things happening in Lake Travis. But, and I like, my own bias is towards state level policymaking as like a framework that constricts and squeezes and stuff like that. But Austin and Lake Travis are caught in the same vice. Recapture is part of this, but not the whole story. Lake Travis at the moment is not like Austin. Austin is headed into this fiscal year with like a $181 million shortfall. They're
Mm,
closing 10 schools.
yeah.
Lake Travis Independent School
State
District is
takeover
no.
looming, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. Lake Travis is not closing schools. They have laid off a bunch of central office employees. They are trying to cut costs, but it's what I wanna say is simultaneously, like, these 2, the reference to Austin, we're talking about a different district, the financial situation is different, but the overall fiscal and political economic conditions are the same. So the
Right.
fact that, like, districts are making different decisions or weathering, uh, political economic waters differently is not evidence that somebody's got it figured out and somebody else doesn't. It's more just being in different places when political economic conditions changed,
Yeah,
is what I want to say about that. Why are so many districts operating in a deficit? This is a nationwide problem, not just a statewide problem. I am from
sure.
Wisconsin. Almost half of our districts are projecting more expenditures than revenues right now, and it's not because districts are wasteful. It's in my state in particular, it's because of decisions that are made at the state level about how much uh,
Yeah,
revenue districts are entitled to. And Texas's state level policies mirror a lot of state level policies. A lot of state legislatures and state governors are operating from a very similar playbook about how to prioritize certain values and how to write those priorities into policies around funding. That's the place that I want to start. But I want to deviate immediately and talk about stadiums because I'm really curious to hear
well,
about stadiums
I
and
don't
bonding.
know. I mean, we could talk about stadiums. I mean, I think what you're saying is super important. Maybe we'll pause here before
Okay.
we take on the recaptcha. And now I'm thinking of captcha, you know, the
Yeah. Yes.
prove you're a human. You know, this is a recaptcha. Um, like I think it's important to understand these larger kinds of structural trends,
Hmm.
you know, that deficits are hit. I mean, I think there was a Washington Post article that you sent me or that I saw and sent you, you know, like half of school districts are in some kind of budget shortfall.
Yes.
And, you know, the demographic thing is there. And like, you know, the caller is saying, you know, the story that we get is that enrollment is falling, and it is a convenient trend to point to because no one can deny that
Yeah.
this is happening, right? Like this, it is just true. Like there are not as many people who were born, and funding is tied to this. But like also these numbers, and it happens so frequently. Not only are we've talked about before how quantities are unstable, like different people will say that a deficit is one number or another, but
Yeah.
also like um, quantities typically occur in averages, and also quantities occur in like the averages hide so much
Yes.
particularity. Like the
Yeah.
quantity is a kind of, you know, and I think it's important to talk about numbers generally. Like numbers are a form of discourse, like it's a language, and it's an abstract language. The abstraction is at the one moment very solid. It's very obdurate. Like when you count three apples or whatever. Of course, it's
Yeah.
three apples, and it's like you can't. The numbers are very they're powerful because they are like obdurate in this way that you can't argue with, but at the same time, like just as concrete as they are, they're also extremely abstract. Like what the number names can like which three apples, like whose apples, like where did you pick them? Like from a tree? Did they fall on the ground? Are they rotten? Um, and just in this case, like the number of a declining enrollment or the number of a deficit, or in this case, like attendance numbers, like how many kids go to your school at what
Yes.
time and when that count happens, and then what that count means, like they're hugely like they're so particular. Like it's such an abstract number. I don't know. I just what you were saying made me think of this, what it means in Lake Travis, Texas, right now, given who's in charge, Vasquez in charge of the state government, like, and how these counting things work. I don't know. It seemed
Yeah.
like really important to
I
not,
mean, this is really
for the
important.
caller. And
And it's not so we were talking about enrollment versus attendance. This is a wonderful way to talk about like the abstraction of number and
yes,
the way that it concretely bears. I mentioned that Texas is one of only a handful of states that uses some form of attendance as the number to which funding is tied. It's not necessarily that one of these is preferable to the other.
yeah,
I live in a state where it is pegged to enrollment, and they do like to try to like smooth out year to year fluctuations. They'll use like a 3-year average enrollment in order to allocate funding or to determine how much funding a district is entitled to. But each year, there is one day, the third
yes,
Friday of September, I
yes.
think, in which like every student who is in school that day, that's your enrollment.
That's
So
the number.
that's the number. And like it's I I mean, last year my daughter was in pre-kindergarten and so didn't count for state metrics in general, but I was like my neighbors whose pre-kindergartner is in her class had like happened to go up north for like that Friday and I was like, "You what?" I mean, that's taking $10,000 out of
Did
the
you know that you
whatever.
just robbed the school district of thousands of dollars because
And
you
that makes
just
like
happened to?
and I'm joking because that doesn't matter, but that is because 4-year-olds don't count for this particular kind of thing, but
But
that's
that's the
also
vibe.
real. That like that
That's a
if
real thing. And there's also, just as a footnote, like, this matters more and more, particularly as voucher programs are ascendant, because, when you take attendance, like, I'm just thinking of the story from Sarasota, Florida, that I learned about, where
Mhm.
like people are putting their kids into the voucher program, and they're getting state money directly into their bank
Yep,
account,
yep.
right? And which is sort of, it's to compensate them for expenses that they have for going to private school, and
Mhm.
basically reimburse whatever property taxes, their school
Yeah.
district is having. Okay. But then these people sign up for the voucher program, get the state money in their pocket rather than to the school district, and then send their kids to the schools.
Yeah.
And the attendance doesn't pick it up because it's
Right.
only one time that it's
Yes.
it's only one sliver. So as long as they don't send their kid or whatever, it doesn't there's no way in which they can be caught.
I mean, that happens. That's like there's such a common narrative in Wisconsin in particular that is exactly like that, where like charter schools in particular, this has
Yeah.
been an issue with, but also private schools will like count kids as enrolled through that third Friday of September and then counsel them out if they have special
Yes.
needs or whatever. And
Yes.
you're like, aha, we are. And part of this, I'll just say, is the fact that, I mean, voucher programs any sort of privatization program works the same way, and it's related to the way that public schools are funded, but, like, a big problem here is that the funding has to come up front. Like, it is very easy
Right.
to start, like, an absolute fraud school if you wanted to, minimize your overhead, convince a bunch of parents to send their kids there that you're gonna do something amazing for them.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you fail in 3 years if you've kept
Right.
your overhead low because you
It's
will
how
have
much
gotten all
money
the
you got.
money.
Yeah.
You will have
And
already
then you
gotten
could
paid.
purchase property and then develop it and get into a deal with real estate developers, and there you have the charter school industry.
It's wi it's wild how that works. You said something a few episodes ago that, like, I only heard when I was editing it prop you were talking about officials' work and about taking out insurance on,
The
one's
home
property.
value insurance, yeah.
Yeah, on home value insurance so that people wouldn't be so tied to the quality of their schools out of, like, fear of their home values declining. I don't know if you've read Bob Meister's Justice is an Option, um,
Oh, I've heard
like,
of
he's
that
trying
one.
to
No,
use, like,
people
the
have told
logic.
me I have to read it, and I haven't read it.
There's a 3-page excerpt that I started teaching in my doc classes where he's just like, "Let me give you an example of this thing, and I'll just use school privatization." He, like, is not talking about schools anywhere in the book, but he's
Wow.
like, "Here is how this works." He's like, "What if" I'm just gonna run this idea by you and blow your mind real quick. He's
I
like,
love that.
"What if the state, instead of doing what it's doing now about, like, putting pressure on districts to, uh, generate test scores, etc. What if the state just created a synthetic financial asset that it gave to every kid, uh, and it was inversely pegged to the whatever school quality criteria the state measures, like
Huh.
of that kid, so that as the schools get worse, the value of the asset goes up, so that
Oh
when
my
they graduate
god.
from a failing system, the state is obligated to compensate them on the back end to that extent. He's like, what if you did that? Then suddenly, instead of basically subsidizing the way that charter schools and other private school organizations short the public school system,
Oh my god.
you would effectively force private schools, charter schools to pony up that money up front if they wanted to recruit kids out of the system.
That's
They
so
would have to
cool.
buy that asset from them
That is
in
so
order
cool.
to. I was like, but it works like the logic is the same as insurance. You're basically trying to
Yeah,
redistribute risk of
right.
school failure. The point that Meister made so brilliantly, and this is going to be near a quote because I've said it so much, is he's like the problem with putting all these pressures on school, putting schools at risk of failure if their metrics don't line up, is that the students that they're supposed to serve are still long on their educations. They
Yeah.
do not have he
Right.
uses the phrase a diversified portfolio of social advantages.
Oh,
They
yeah, of course.
need education. And if you're not doing anything to defray that long position as the state, you're doing it wrong and doing it indirectly through
That's so
the
good.
public schools as well. It was amazing. Anyway,
Oh, that's
I
so
highly
good. That's
recommend that
like
book.
oh, there's so much I'm thinking about, but I don't know how much of a tangent we should go on, but,
We're already
I mean,
considerably out
first
there.
of all, I just wanna say, like, that's an idea. Like, I think
Yeah.
when doing, I think, political economy, school finance, the stuff, movements, critical theory, like, you have to really sift through the ideas and the non-ideas. Let's close all the charter schools. Like, that's not an idea. Like,
Right.
sorry. Like, you could try to make them public schools again,
Hmm.
and or you can try putting moratoria on charter schools, but you still have the charter school problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of people, they get involved, they want to say, oh, I want to close all the charter schools. That's not an idea. You know what's an idea? The thing you just said, which is
Right. Which
creating
is
synthetic
Meister's idea. Yeah.
assets, which is Meister's idea, right? But you
Yeah.
you you're adapting it. And the other thing I wanted to note, just for future talking about, is the concept of discounting, which I read an amazing book by Lulia Daganova. Um,
Yes.
and the idea, like, discounting and thinking about the value of education,
Yes.
how we're long or short of it and stuff.
Yeah.
I just have to listen because I think Sylvan might be waking up.
Absolutely. And while you're doing that listening, I want to chime in there. Like this is the perfect thing. We were just talking about it, enrollment and attendance as these sort of unstable, they seem very solid. You have this many kids in schools, but the minute you have to get particular about how you're counting those kids and when, I hear
You
Sylvan
hear it? You hear the
started to like, "Wah."
You're gonna give him a
The
little
minute
bit
you
of
start
time.
talking about particularities, then it all starts to seem a little absurd. You're like, you know, is chronic absenteeism missing 10% of available school days or is it 16%? It really matters for this kind of thing. What does average daily attendance mean? What happens when you add weights to it?
There's weighted
But
average daily
yeah,
attendance, right? WADA, and then
yeah.
WADM, and then
But the bigger part of unstable quantities as far as budgeting goes is really, again, a temporal one. And it has specific, like your reference to discounting, uh, made me think of this in particular. The way that, if we're talking about closing a building that we need to invest in, people are like, okay, we're saving ourselves $30 million by closing this building. And I'm like, sure, in one manner of accounting, if you like divest yourself of this building that needs $30 million of maintenance, that's $30 million you won't have to spend, but you also never had to allocate that money to the project in the first place. I'm not
Right.
saving myself money by like not buying a Porsche on a daily basis. That's not money I get to count as savings. It's even though it's like a decision that I theoretically could make, it's not. It's
Right.
not. But the way that we value outcomes in the future
Yes.
is what we are talking about kind of
The
consistently
time
when we
value
are
of
budgeting
this
and when we are
thing.
accounting for things in particular. What like the difference between one budget forecast and another is
Yeah.
can come down to like decisions about how we're accounting for the costs that we are foreseeing. It's so much of it is speculative, and I don't
Yes.
necessarily mean that in a pejorative sense, though
Oh,
also I mean it in a pejorative sense. We've
yes,
talked a lot
pejorative
about
and non-pejorative.
we've
I mean,
talked a lot
it's
about like
this discounting, like, I think, this changes the channel a little bit,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I think it matters in the hundreds of millions of dollars most when states are making contributions to pension funds
yeah,
and the pension managers agree on a discount rate, that is the assumed rate of return on the pension. Literally, like, a point difference on this particular rate could mean, like, hundreds of millions of dollars that the state is then obligated to contribute with the
yeah,
employer, being the district, into a
right.
pension fund, which is and that's completely, utterly speculative. They actually pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to market analysts to tell them whether it should be 5% or 6%. And if you were to just increase the discount rate by like half a point, like 50 or like half a point, you could save $100 million on your education budget just like right there at the state level. And I think this could completely be politicized. People could have a debate about this.
Yes. Yes. I mean, like that's the way that decisions with serious financial consequences up and down the sort of ladder of governance from federal to local, the amount that it just sort of depends on like certain rituals of reasoning your ways through numbers and actuarial charts and all this stuff to an outcome. There's a lot of decisions in there. It's not, uh, it's not using a divining rod or like studying entrails, but it's also not that. But I'll tell you that there is a great recent book out by Carissa Veliz called Prophecy that is well worth everybody's time. It's like the history of the people who tell rulers what's going to happen,
Yes.
from the ancient world to the National Bureau of Economic Research. So it's
I love that.
it's really good to our current age of AI. We have gotten a little bit off track.
Yeah, we
The
should
last
get
thing,
back.
yeah,
Yeah,
let's
we
get back
could
to Lake Travis. Let's
keep
get back to
riffing,
Lake
keep
Travis.
riffing. But I could try to tie back in the discount rate, into bonding because I think one thing I'm really
Yes, let's do
interested
it.
in looking at, one thing I'm really looking at, really interested in looking at is the ways in which discount rates find their way into school finance. And like one of the very clearest is pension funds. But I think definitely knowing bonds, like another way that they do that is when they calculate and set out a maturity schedule for a bond. That is to say, like when you pay what you're going to pay and how much you're going to pay, they use discount rates to try to calculate the time value of the money over a 20 to sometimes 30-year period. Bonds have these really long amortization schedules where you
Hmm.
pay down the loan, and they use discount rates to like calculate that, and that discount rate then comes to bear on the debt service of the school district
Yes.
for a given year, right? And like the way in which those calculations happen, like that's the people's money. And
Hmm.
one thing that's really interesting about Texas that I think that I saw in this particular story, and then maybe we'll go in local to the bonding and then come out to the capture,
Yes.
to the recapture.
Capture.
In like, okay, so what I always, and I said this in my TikTok, and maybe people didn't know what I meant, but like whenever I look at a school district, I always go to EMMA first, the Electronic Municipal Market Access dashboard, and I always look at their debt story because, and this shout out to the Debt Collective, generally because I think their analysis since Occupy Wall Street, from coming from David Graeber's work on debt, like has been really helpful in the sense that when you approach things from the perspective of debt, you get I think a fuller, interesting, different picture than you do otherwise. In school finance, we don't do that. It's always operating expenditure, it's always
Yes,
tax
yes.
grants, but it's never the borrowing, and it's never the lending picture. So I always start from that angle. And I saw a couple things kind of immediately, and that's that this Lake Travis school district is up to its eyeballs in debt. They've got $486 million in outstanding debt that they have to pay down. Um, and they've got $11 million just in the last year in their sinking fund. Now, the sinking fund is, I think it's a wonderful, there's a lot of water language all over the place when
Yeah,
it comes
yeah.
to debt, liquidity and uh,
Flows.
flows and floating debt.
Yeah.
And now sinking fund is one of them. And a sinking fund it's just a vivid image because let's say you owe money to your creditors, your credit card bills, your medical bills, your mortgage, your car payment, or whatever. Like the money that you get, your revenue, your income, like that has to be immediately set aside to pay off your debt. That's sunk, right? It's like you can't use that money for anything other than paying what you've already borrowed. And so school districts have something like a sinking fund, which is sometimes like a debt service fund, but other times not. It's money that you have to put aside to pay. It's like debt is money in and money out all the time, right?
Yep.
Always. And so this district, while the deficit looks to be about $1.2 million in Lake Travis, which again, juxtaposing with Austin, like very small comparatively,
Mhm,
like
mhm.
they have $11 million just in their sinking fund to pay their debt service, which I think is an interesting juxtaposition, right? But not only that. So like there's $1.2 million deficit. Okay, now you have 11 million in your sinking fund. If you didn't pay as much into your sinking fund, then you wouldn't have to. If we didn't, buy and sell public school districts and public governments on Wall Street like commodities, and there were pay as you go infrastructure programs, we don't have to deal with this. But I think there's also this really interesting story, something that I hadn't seen before that I thought was really funny, which is that districts will sometimes decide to pay their loans early or more in excess of
Yes.
what they have to, and that's a decision that they make to pay down the loan. Now, it's a prudent decision. We've talked about this before. If you have a mortgage and you pay more on your mortgage, you're ahead of the
Mhm.
game. But they make these decisions, and then they go out and say that they're in a deficit as though they can't do anything, as though it's just a
Right.
natural, as though it's just about enrollment. But they're making all kinds of other complex decisions that people don't know about and don't understand, and then they come out and say that they can't do anything, whereas they've made like 100 decisions that were completely private from the public. Then the public just has to kind of accept it because they get confronted with a budget that's like 300 pages long and that they can't parse.
I mean,
Um,
that's the thing, right? It's
yeah,
like they come out this it's like the information is structurally public. People can see what happens, but if you don't look
yeah,
at school finance a lot, it's impossible to figure
right,
out. And oftentimes, district leader, like I see this all the time in my day job, will be like keeping it simple as priority one, so that what we are
yeah.
doing is predictable and we're not going to upset people within that, like within that predictability. There's a lot of flexibility for
There's so much
districts if
flexibility,
predictability is
and
your.
that element of numbers that we were talking about before, that they're both so concrete and so abstract at the same time. Like there's so much like slippage, and there's so much contingency behind numbers that appear to be so obdurate, so fixed in place. Like it seems immutable, but it's actually very mutable. um this is sort of one of those, a similar kind of instance. And I'll just say too, it's not just the like ways in which we present budgets when it comes to transparency, but it's also the time that we give people to sit with it.
Yeah.
Like you need time to make sense of this stuff, right? Like people need time to understand what's going on. You can't just say, "Oh, well, we made a great presentation. We gave a great presentation. People still don't get it." No, how much time did you give them? I mean, did you give them months and months to sit and study it? Did you give them time? Like, do we? as a government, as a society, actually, like, maybe try to pay people to take time out of their week to read the budget so that they understand. We don't do any of that. But this is all to say that in Travis, they did something a little tricky where they decided, okay, so there were a bunch of bond referenda, most recent being in 2023. These bond referenda, it appears to me, are all about building and maintaining stadiums. And this is another thing that people on TikTok got mad at me for. They're like, it's not just stadiums. They're seeing enrollment increases and they have to build like a new high school. But then I saw another comment where someone was like, it is stadiums. People in Lake Travis are crazy about their football, just like everyone in Texas, right? It's like a Friday Night Lights sort of situation. But this commenter, I don't know if it's a he or she. I just said he. But like this commenter was like, yeah, why does my school have 4 stadiums? And I was like,
Mhm.
what? 4 sta and they also went on to list, like, all these different track and fields, 3 soccer fields, 4 stadiums,
Mhm.
like, you know, there's been a building craze in, like, Travis around stadiums. They did a bond in 2023, and the thing
And in
about taking out
2022.
and in 22, like and then there was a big another one in 2017, like, they've just been taking out money, taking out money, taking out money, taking out these loans to do all of this building, and, like, what that does is that means that you have to pay every year a certain amount of debt service, right? And they put $11 million in their sinking fund. Okay, fine. But they decided to refund. Now another element of bonding is refunding. So when you refund a bond, you're actually like you're kind of restructuring the deal. It's like when you're refinancing a mortgage a little bit. You actually are getting a new mortgage in that sense. You're taking out a new loan, but you're replacing the existing debt with other debt on different terms. So a refunding bond like is a bond, but it's not adding new debt. It's replacing debt. And so they're like when they're refunding bonds, they do it at a certain clip. And so they've decided to pre-refund. I've never seen a pre-refund amount for $6.5 million, which is an early refunding. It's a prepayment on the refunding bond. And so there's actually a table in the bond statement that has pre-refunding. And like, the question is, did they really have to pre-refund $6.5 million?
Mm.
dollars? Is that something that did you have a conversation, with your people about that? There's also one other thing that I just wanted to say. I don't know if this is a typo, but I love these little phrasings that you can find in bond documents. So
Mhm.
there's the pre-refunded principle, and then there's the unrefunded principle. So the pre-refunded principle is what you're going to pay in. The unrefunded principle is now the amount that's left. Okay. There's a defined
Wow.
column, unrefunded, refunded. QSIP.
My
Okay. Now, what's an unrefunded, refunded QSIP? A QSIP number, every single tranche, every single subset of a bond gets a QSIP. It's a number that actually districts have to pay for. That is assigned by the Security and Exchange Commission when the district is selling a bond that is selling themselves on Wall Street. And now, because every tranche gets a QSIP, that means that the pre-refunded now will get a QSIP, the unrefunded will get a QSIP, but this is an unrefunded, refunded QSIP.
All I
Which
wanna say about that
is
is that
little tangles.
if this were The Big Short, some celebrity would have delivered that little part of it right
Yeah, like
now.
Margot Robbie in a bathtub, like,
Exactly.
or whatever, but yeah, this is all Big Short stuff. It's all,
Yeah.
anyway, so I just wanted to provide this landscape because I feel like, maybe I'll summarize it this way. There's a paper by my great friend Jason Wozniak
Mm.
and, oh my God, Francis Negron Montaner, who's actually a scholar, a Latino studies, Latin American studies professor at Columbia who specializes in Puerto Rico. They put out a
Mm.
paper last year called, uh, well, the main concept of the paper is instructional harm, and they created an instructional harm index they're one of the first people to juxtapose debt service at a school district with expenditures on curriculum and salaries and stuff. And they create a number called an instructional harm index based on the amount of debt service that a school district has to pay. Okay. Now, in conversation with them about this paper, one thing I told them was like the tricky thing about this is that debt service is not always just extractive. Okay, like it is extractive. It's essentially extractive.
Yep.
But like there are some places that have really high property values. They're revenue rich, and they borrow a ton to try to to get themselves the infrastructure that they want. Okay,
Yeah.
and I was
That's right.
thinking of like Carmel Clay in Indiana, which is I wrote about in my book. Like they had multiple planetariums and stuff, and like so when it comes to debt and taking out debt, like it's not just that poor school district like Reading,
Yes.
Pennsylvania or Philadelphia needs to borrow because they don't have enough money from the state. A lot of people get stuck on that. They think,
Yes.
"Oh, well, we have to go to Wall Street because we don't get enough money from the state." That's not how
Right.
it works.
Right.
School districts have to go get money from Wall Street no matter what, whether there's enough money from the state or not. Um, and but also like it's not debt service is not only a marker of extraction, it's a marker of extravagance. So they've had this wonderful phrase. There's a dialectic of extravagance and extraction when it comes to debt service and school finance. And what we're seeing here in Lake Travis is the dialectic of extravagance in debt because they have the money to pay it back. And so they take out all kinds of bonds to build all their stadiums because they have a Friday Night Lights mindset. And the other thing, the final thing I'll say, and this is going to transition to the recapture, which is that another thing I learned on TikTok from a comment was that the reason why Texas districts bond so much in the way that they bond is because the bond revenues are not subject to recapture. Okay,
Yes. That's the
so
part that I've been waiting to jump in on.
so now I'm gonna throw it to you. And after we
Perfect.
had this sort of local picture and like Travis, like they have all this money that they have to pay debt service, which they're choosing to do. And one of the reasons why they're probably choosing to do it is to avoid recapture. So now let's hear about that.
Let's talk about how Texas school finance works. One of the ways that just to piggyback on all of the stuff that you were just saying, one of the things that is hardest for people to wrap their minds around is the difference between operating expenditures or operating obligations and debt service obligations, or like basically money for facilities. You just mentioned earlier that like it is districts will borrow even if they're adequately funded by the state because it's a measure of extravagance. It's them paying for the buildings that they want. To really like flip your mind around or to wrap your mind around that number, if you think about like if you think adequate funding for the state should incorporate all facilities needs, like the needs for construction, we're not talking about like $10,000 per pupil annually. We're talking like $25,000 per
Yeah.
pupil annually. The costs over a 20-year period of construction, if you want to build that into an annual uh, get from the state up front, we're talking about tripling the size of school budgets, not like adding a little bit of state funding. That's why districts borrow for facilities projects, period. It is just not
Yep.
feasible to do big construction
It's
projects
a
of any
lumpy
kind, whether it's
cost.
stadiums or like adequate facilities or like rehabbing old buildings from within your annual budget, no matter like whatever the reasonable upward ceiling on an annual budget get is, it is going to be smaller than that.
Our third
Sylvan
member
joins
has
us.
joined us. The third member of the committee.
In Texas, this matters for there's two things that really affect the facility side of the equation. We had mentioned, Texas came up in our Sitka conversation because
Yeah.
Alaska has a sovereign wealth fund. So does Texas. And every bond that is issued by a Texas public school is backed by that
Yes.
permanent school fund. So that
Yes.
makes borrowing cheaper on the front end.
Oh, wait,
That's
can I
thing
can I
one.
just mention something? I don't know if you're gonna
Yeah.
say this, but this is something I wanted to mention. Because it's backed by the permanent fund, the attorney general has to approve them. I don't know if you were gonna say that, but
Wow. I wasn't going to say that.
Ken Paxton, who,
Is
running for
running for
Senate
Senate
against
and yeah.
Tallarico, like, he has to approve every single one of these.
That's crazy.
It's
Like if you were a statewide politician, it would be very bad for business to suddenly start.
just start saying no. Anyway, I interrupted you.
But the bigger thing is how local property taxes fund schools. Texas is a state where there are two kinds of local property tax rates. One called M&O. It's basically operating
Yes,
and facilities tax rates,
that's right.
and they are separate. So
That's right.
there's this INS rate, which is interest and sinking, that funds facility. And then there's M&O, or maintenance and operations, that funds day-to-day stuff. What is happening in Texas is two things. First of all, state funding and the formula by which districts can raise revenue through a combination of local property taxes and state aid. The state has been sitting on that, sat on that for a period of 5 years. It just kept it flat through from like 2019 to 2023, even as inflation is driving up expenses. So districts are not allowed to raise more revenue through their total, the combination of regular state aid and local property taxes for operating purposes,
Yep.
beyond that level. They're not allowed to keep up with inflation. In 2023, that got adjusted upward by $55 per pupil. So not
Yeah.
only not making up for past flatness, but also continuing not to keep up with inflation. So that problem remains
Yep.
in place. But because that sort of revenue limit formula,
Sorry. I
no
just got to
problem.
get this out of his way.
Yeah, oh, don't worry. I'm just going to talk to your retreating back about this. Because that revenue limit formula only affects the operating aspects of things, the interest and sinking tax services, school districts' ability to borrow and to tax local property to cover those borrowing expenses, that remains unrestricted.
Right.
And what that leads to is what we're seeing in Lake Travis. I mean, Lake Travis in 2022, they went out for what was it? 20, I got to find, like, just massive borrowing projects, as we have already talked about. They failed the first one in 2022, and then they took out 93 million for this new stadium in 2023.
23. That sounds right.
Like, I mean, the mill rate for Lake Travis ISD is it's 327, 328 if we're averaging. That's like half the total mill rate for a lot of school districts in my area, and it's
Yeah.
just for facilities
Just for
right now.
facilities.
Yeah, the
And the
M&O
mill
rate.
rate, just let's talk about a mill rate's one of my favorite things to try to explain to people. It's
Yeah,
like for every $1,000 of assessed value. So your school district's going to have property in it because we're in racial capitalism. You're going to have property value, and that property value is what you're going to tax to get the money for your school. Now, when you tax money for the money that you have for your school, you have to do it at a certain rate to pay for the budget that you've just passed. That rate occurs in however many dollars per thousands of dollars you have to tax. That is your mill rate. It's short for millenesium, every thousandth. I used to think it was like mills, like how many mills you had in your district, like how many like bread mills or
exactly. Like
whatever, but it's
grain
not. It's
mills. Yeah.
millenesium, and it's every thousandth. And like, just as one of my favorite little like gotcha points, it's like when people do tax revolts and they say that they pay so much in taxes, like they're complaining about absolute value of tax,
Yes,
but like
exactly.
if you were to look at their mill rate versus their like diverse working class neighbors, you'd see that they're paying like a fraction of the mill rate
Yes,
of what their neighbors are
exactly.
paying. Their neighbors, like it's the working class people that pay way more in
Yes.
taxes. And we know that
As
because
a
of the mill
percentage of
rates.
their
As
value. Yes.
That's right, as a percentage of the property value, because their property value is much lower, so they have to
Yeah,
tax it much higher. They're the ones that are paying the highest taxes. Anyway, sorry,
that's
go
right.
on.
No, that's great. That's going to, like, just a little foreshadowing for what recapture is about.
Recapture.
But the recapture. So uh this interest in sinking property tax levy is unrestricted, while the maintenance and operations tax levy is restricted by the state, or it plays into the form. The M&O tax rate is governed by the overall, like, Texas basic allotment formula. So that's thing one
Thing one.
to note. But what it creates for every district, including Lake Travis, is basically like, how can we be doing all this construction and simultaneously be in an operating deficit? And this is the answer.
And
Like,
firing people.
exactly. It is like the capital expenditures part of it, the facilities expenses,
Yes.
are just financially separated from the operating costs, and you
Yes.
cannot make transfers between them. The
No.
revenue comes from different places and has to be used for those particular.
There's a
That's the
firewall.
thing to understand.
There's a firewall there, and the
Yeah.
firewall, it's like one of the things I really am like really wanting to do more and more, like, philosophy, of public
Mhm.
finance. And one of the philosophical questions, I'm gonna give a workshop at Fordham actually on a
Mm.
paper that I've drafted called "Must We Borrow for CapEx?"
I love it.
And like, it's so philosophically important to understand the difference between operating expenditure and capital expenditure because the revenues are so different. The
Mhm.
revenue cycles of tax grants versus borrowing. And the reason why we have to borrow for capital expenditure and how the accounting is very different, but also the ways in which they're maddeningly ambiguous. Like, so they're
Yes.
both very different. Like, there's a way in which in this paper I try to, like, be provocative and say, like, there's an eternal truth, capital E, capital T, like, that because of space and time, it's almost like Kantian, like, because
Sure.
there is space and because there is time, there is just, like, a difference in, like, building a school versus paying a teacher on a yearly basis. Like,
Yes.
those
Oh,
are
I
different.
love
Like,
this.
no
Yes.
matter if there's, like, space, luxury, techno communism, where artificial intelligence runs everything and you can 3D print all your resources, like, there's just gonna be a difference in the kind of expenditure for infrastructure than there is for regular operating expenses. Like,
Right.
that's not gonna
Because we
go away
continue to live in the physical universe, this is.
because we live in space and time. It just has to
Yeah.
do with space and time and cost, maybe as like a
Yeah.
function of space and time,
I love
because
this.
right? Like, that doesn't go anywhere. But the way in, and this is a term from Marx, like the way we tackle that feature of nature is utterly, utterly a policy decision, right? It
That's
isn't
right.
like, and you can tackle it as a credit problem or you can tackle it as a grant problem. Like, you can
That's right.
tackle it as fiscal or you can tackle it as monetary. And like we choose, and then if you were to choose it, let's say you choose as a monetary problem, like that's to say monetary policy, credit, borrowing and lending. You can choose to do it as public credit or private credit. You could choose to do it as
Yes.
a market mechanism where people buy and sell credit that is then given as liquidity to
Mhm.
public governments, or you can publicly generate it through things through the Federal Reserve or through the Treasury or whatever. As a country, we choose to tackle this eternal truth of space and time as
Yep.
a private credit problem. And thus, the accounting mechanisms for these two things have to be kind of kept in these separate lanes, even though the revenue that a public school district is going to get is going to be paying your operating and paying your capital, like your private property tax revenues and your state grant
Yes.
revenues and your
Yes.
minimal federal revenues. Those are all going to be paying debt service and whatever. But like it's all coming from the same pot. But like the spoons and the mouths
Oh, I like this.
are so different the way we choose to do it. This is the thing. This is one of the things that just people don't understand.
Yes, and let me just tie this into the way that the discourse works around or around education and school finance in general, and I
Yes.
see this play out even more from board members and superintendents than from the general public. The general public will show up with, like, angry with a question about, like, like, "How can we be building stadiums and firing teachers at the same time? Like, how can
Yeah.
that be?"
Yeah.
But all too often people in charge will basically be like, "Listen, we live in space and time, therefore this decision had to be
Yes.
made." And they're just like, I have called this elsewhere the yada yada problem of education policy
I
at
love
the side
that.
of, like, basically it's
I love that.
like I'm gonna state an undeniable fact and then I'm gonna yada yada my
Oh, but
way
it's such a
to,
good
like, the
point that you're
decision.
making, to interrupt you again. It's such a good point
Yeah.
that you're making that they weaponize the obduracy of this eternal truth to make the fixedness, the
Mhm.
immutability of it, they extend it way past where it is. Like, I have a
Yeah,
pizza tattoo, by the way.
exactly,
That's what
exactly.
that
They,
is.
like, sort of erase all of the flexibility that's in the middle of that, all of the decisions that have to get made, and I will confess to feeling a large degree of sympathy for the people who are in that spot,
Yes,
especially when they're
yes.
responding to
The budget officials.
"How can this be?" And you're like, "Well, you haven't even done the reading.
There
I
and
how
yeah,
am I gonna
and
communicate this to you?"
I'm always trying to tell movements, like, I'm always trying to tell movements, you have to understand this. Like, we have to be in dialogue with these people because they're caught in the cross currents of racial capitalism, just like you
Mm,
are. Like, and to fight with them tooth and nail, like you have to fight with them tooth and nail for some
yeah.
things, but for other things, we have to understand where they're coming from and where the pressures are, like to successfully force them to do what we want them to do. If you don't understand what their situation is, you're not going to be able to talk to them in a way that they're going to be able to hear. And this is one of those things.
I have, this is before coming back to Lake Travis, ISD one more time. I have a future book slash paper pitch to make to you. And I'm just going to like put a pin in that real quick. It would be called Two Sides of the Same Coin. And I would be, don't tell me that you've got a, okay, I thought you were reaching for your bookshelf to be like, oh, actually, that's right.
No, no, I don't have a book like that.
Yeah. Two sides of the same
I have a
coin.
mug of tea.
While you were talking, I was reminded of UCLA literature scholar Mitchum Hulse's book
Oh,
After Critique, where he's using a lot of Bruno Latour
oh
and the
yeah.
dynamics of purification. So like just keeping things separate,
I want to read this.
purifying within spheres. And he talks about how he coins the phrase the neoliberal circle, and how like these actually like the act of purification actually like mixes these things together or prevents you
Oh,
from seeing that what you're dealing with is one thing and not two. Anyway,
I
that's
gotta read that because there's Luc Boltanski's book on critique, which is maybe a
yeah.
10 years old, in the Latourian
Hmm.
tradition, and they're thinking about critique. And
Yeah.
I want to write a critique of municipal finance, so I have to.
Oh, I love
And
this.
anyway, keep going, keep going.
Okay, let's get back to Lake Travis real quick.
Yeah,
So
back to Lake Travis.
they're able to borrow a lot, partly because borrowing rates are relatively cheap thanks to Texas's sovereign wealth fund,
Yes,
and thanks to the fact that they are able to levy taxes locally in an unrestricted way.
right.
At the same time, now we're talking about state level dynamics that are impacting every district in Texas's operating capacity. Like a lot of states, Texas did maintain the basic allotment, their foundation funding number. They held that flat for years. And when they raised it, they only raised it a little bit. At the same time, there's two big things that have happened. One is uh, tax compression, basically. I'm going to get into what that means in a second. And the other is a massive new pot of state money for schools in the form of categorical aids, which falls into a pattern of particularly conservative governments appearing to give a whole lot of money to schools without, in fact, giving a lot of spending power to schools, or spending discretion to schools, I should say. And I'll say a little bit more about both of those things. Let's do the tax compression thing first. As we have seen in Missouri, for instance, who has a similar sort of Hancock amendment, basically, if a district's total property value rises more than 2.5% in a particular year, the tax rate for that district is compressed to protect property taxpayers from having to fund above that 2.5% rate. And the state makes up for that by basically holding districts harmless, saying that they will backfill up to the level of the basic allotment that is tied to the weighted average daily attendance times like this allotment from state funds. So districts whose inability to raise property taxes at, at in line with its actual property value, the state will make up for them. But there's two big problems here. The state's allotment has been held constant at a too low level, number one. And number two, for really property wealthy districts whose, like, the state money wasn't making any difference anyway,
Which is on
they are
purpose.
sort
They
of,
hold it down for on
yeah,
purpose.
they are being doubly compressed. Basically, they can't raise as much money to fund their schools as they want. The state is keeping that down artificially. Now, this is what gets us into recapture, because one of the really odd things is that Lake Travis ISD's the amount of money that is flowing out of the district. I think this year it's forecasted at $34 million of property taxes that is flowing from the district to the state that the district can't use for its own schools. That's understandably making people really mad. How can we be in a, what is it, uh, a relatively small deficit, $4 million a
It
year
was
for a
4.5, and then
$4.5
property
million?
values went up, so they got it down to 1.2.
Yeah. So, okay. So they're down to like a $1.2 million. They're like, but we're sending $34 million to the state and we have this $1.2 million deficit. Why can't we make this work out?
Right.
But that number is way down. I feel like Texas's recapture, the total recapture amount in Texas has gone from like $3 billion a few years ago down to like 1.5 billion, and it's because of this compression mechanism. It's basically like as
Exactly.
they're holding local property tax rates down, there's less money for Texas to recapture. So Texas has this recapture thing, which is meant to be redistributive, but the effort to protect local property taxes is giving the state less money to recapture and effectively undermining the redistributive thing, the redistributive aspect of that. It's harming the state's ability to help districts who can't afford to raise their local taxes as much as Lake Travis's can, but it is also hurting the politics and the discourse in places like Lake Travis for specifically the reason that Lake Travis is a property wealthy district whose local M&O taxes are subject to recapture and yet are still facing a deficit because the state is artificially constraining the amount of money that they are entitled to raise through the combination of general state aids
Yeah.
and local property taxes. And that's the part that's really difficult for people to understand. How are you taking $34 million
Yep.
when we are in an operating deficit? How is that just?
And just to like think about this a little bit, um, here we see the perils of redistribution and centralization.
Yeah.
Because if you want to try to redistribute through a centralized government in the United States, and then fascists take over, then the fascists are in control of your
Yeah.
redistributive mechanisms. They set the floor. They set the ceiling. It's on their terms. So,
Yes.
here we have a situation. In Vermont, they're not doing that, right? They have to redistribute it. In Alaska, it's a little different, but they're sort of in between, somewhere in between Texas and Vermont.
Okay, well, let me talk about one last thing here. So the redistribution thing is that is a relatively common factor in other states' school finance formulas for exactly this reason. In Texas, it exists because Texas is the state, obviously, in which San Antonio versus Rodriguez was decided. The federal Supreme Court case that held that students do not have a federal right to education that would license states to do a redistributive thing, but a Texas state Supreme Court case in 1989 held that the state constitution does require states to do this, Texas to do this distribution thing. That's what spawns recapture in general, and it's a popular mechanism. If you're trying to equalize school spending by effort, so like a district that has the same M&O tax rate across to another district in the state, if their tax rates are the same, they should get the same amount of money from that, irrespective of differences in property wealth, is the basic idea. That's not exactly how it works in Texas, but that's the basic impetus.
Doing this episode has really given me like pause, in terms of thinking about how much to advocate for those kinds of redistributive mechanisms.